Well, hi, class. Welcome to week one. I wanted to put together a little video and make some comments about the discussion board, specifically for the question about finding a spouse and the book, The Five Paths of Finding a Spouse. And I put together a slide that some of you have seen where I categorize the five paths into two main columns. There's the principle directed paths, that's the countercultural, the purposeful, and the guided path. These are more principle directed, though the authors of all of these five paths say that parents should be involved. But with these three, parental involvement and parental guidance uh, is one of the principles that you should factor in. Whereas the courtship path and the betrothal path are clearly parent directed. In fact, the courtship path is really directed by the father, and the betrothal path is the parents are setting up a betrothal, and the betrothal path actually says that when betrothed, you are committed. You're not married yet, but you cannot break that betrothal unless there's some kind of sexual immorality, like in the case of Mary and Joseph. At least they thought there was sexual immorality. Now, um, I think the book does a good job of presenting the different positions. I just want to raise one concern specifically with the betrothal path presentation. And I want to talk about just a simple um, hermeneutics issue or interpretation issue. When we interpret the Bible, there's a simple phrase that's going to be helpful in making sense of Scripture, and that is that description is not prescription. What that means is there are the prescriptive parts of Scripture where we are basically being told or commanded how to behave. And then there are descriptive passages, which, for example, the Gospels are full of description. Jesus went here, Jesus did this, Jesus said that. And here's the concern. Description is not necessarily prescription. And I think the betrothal presentation assumed, for example, that because Mary was betrothed to Joseph and Mary and Joseph are Jesus's parents, that is prescribing that this is how it has to be in every culture. But it's not prescribing that. It is describing that Mary was betrothed to Joseph. That's the way it was done in that culture. But here's the concern if you turn description into prescription. And I like to use an example from Philip in Acts chapter 8, where he goes up to the Ethiopian eunuch, shares the gospel with him, he baptizes him, and then it says this: the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more. He disappears. Now, if we turn this description into prescription, then we're going to come up with something like this, saying the only biblical way to baptize is you baptize the person in an open lake, and then the baptizer must disappear for it to be biblical baptism. Well, I think you can see that that's ridiculous. This is just a description of one baptism, not a prescription for all time. Now, yes, betrothal is found in the Old Testament and it is found in the New Testament. But because it's found and described does not necessarily mean it's being prescribed. Now, Paul does in 1 Corinthians 7 address different groups of people, to the married, to singles, to those who are contemplating divorce. And then in 7:25, he says, now concerning the betrothed. Now, you could jump to the conclusion that because Paul is addressing betrothed people, that this is a biblical command. But realize that he's addressing a group, but what he says to them, what he prescribes to them, is different than just naming the group. In other words, there's no doubt that there were those who were betrothed in the first century in Corinth, but is Paul prescribing betrothal, or is he prescribing something for those who are betrothed? There's a difference there. Again, I don't think we can use this passage to say betrothal is the only biblical way. Now, probably the strongest argument that the author uses for betrothal is 2 Corinthians 11:2, where Paul says, I feel, he's talking to the church, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. So I think he would argue that since we, the church, are betrothed to be married to Christ, and then when he returns, we will be united to Christ. We're in the betrothal stage, and because that analogy pictures the reality of our relationship to Christ, betrothal is biblical. Well, that is somewhat of a dangerous argument. Paul is using the analogy of betrothal to describe our relationship to the Lord. But again, he is not prescribing that it has to be that way. He is using the accepted practice of that day as an analogy to describe our relationship to Christ. But we have to be careful that we don't make betrothal the only way for all time. I think a comparable example is when Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, and then he says, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Now, if we were to take this in the same way that the author takes the betrothal verse, we could say that Jesus washed feet, therefore we are to have a foot washing ceremony. Still practice it today. In fact, some churches do. They consider it a sacrament. But I think the better interpretation is to say Jesus took a activity that culture knew about and was involved in on a regular basis, and he used it to set up a principle. We are to serve one another. We are not to find any job beneath us. And the cultural example was foot washing. I don't think he is universalizing foot washing, and I don't think that using betrothal as an example of our relationship to Christ is universalizing betrothal. So I know this has been more of a lesson on hermeneutics and Bible study, but I wanted to present that to you as you read, because it's easy to get convinced by certain arguments, especially when they say this is the biblical way. Well, how would you prove something is biblical? Well, you got to go beyond just saying I find it here and I find it here. You have to say, is it clearly being prescribed for all time? Now, again, I don't think betrothal, using that as a practice today, would be wrong, but I also don't think the other paths are unbiblical. So there's some comments to think about and to process as you look at that book again. Thanks for paying attention.